Welcome to Green Phoenix RPG, a weekly Dungeons & Dragons podcast from both sides of the screen. I'm your host, Matt, and this is our third episode, The Brewing Storm Behind the Screen. So this is our first behind-the-screen episode, so I just wanted to take a quick minute and explain to you what that's going to be all about. So episode 1, we discussed our first session from a narrative standpoint, and then we had Nate on in the second episode to talk about his opinions as a player on the first session and kind of his takeaways from it. Now we're going to talk about the first session from my point of view, from the Dungeon Master's point of view. What I did leading up to the session, what I was really trying to do in that session, where I was trying to get Nate to go. But before we get into that, let me do a quick recap of the first session so it's fresh in your mind. We started with Tiber on the ship, the Albatross, heading west to the Serpent's Grin Islands, protecting Albert Stillwater, eldest son of the Stillwater family, ruling family of Cerulean. They were running around by an Ichirokan vessel. They met the leader of the Ichirokan band there, Princess Kirika, who explained that their people ships had been sunk by a Cerulean vessel crewed by lizard folk. Nate then accompanied Kirika to the necropolis, where they found a few lizard men and an elf who then stole the chalice of Queen T'Choa from the necropolis. The dead then began rising. They met a Karyok named Marangora, who quelled the dead, but explained to them that without the chalice back, they would not be able to contain it for very long, and the dead would eventually rise and cause all kinds of problems on the islands, and eventually to Cerulean, and then Amarant at large. And then Nate found a clue by having Tiber inspect the lizardmen bodies, and he found that they had ironwood shields very similar to his, and he has a good idea of where they got those and maybe where they're based out of. So, like I said, the first session was really an introduction for Nate to the world, Tiber to the characters, and Nate to Tiber. I really wanted to give him a quick but exciting session to really get the plot started. You know, here's the villain, here's the first mystery, the first plot direction. I gave him a fight that was pretty easy, that he could win, and really get a good sense and a good confidence in his character's abilities. Gave him an NPC right away that he was interested in, which is good, because it provides the DM a bit of a way to have a voice in the game and kind of move the plot or certain conversations the way they need to go. But we'll get into that in a little bit. So like I said, the whole game really started while I was at work one day, and I had this image of this dark and sinister tower floating above the landscape, and everywhere its shadow would fall, the dead would rise from the ground and just destroy and kill everything in the area. So I don't really know where that idea came from. You know, it just popped into my head while I'm sitting at my desk, which was kind of odd, but I liked it. It was good. You know, I was reading Lovecraft at the time. I was reading some Stephen King. It probably had some cosmic horror sort of stuff to it, which this game definitely will eventually get some real cosmic horror aspects to it, because I really think that's where my inspiration was coming from. I mean, you're going to find inspiration all over the place. You're going to find inspiration in books, in movies, in your daily life, comic books, wherever. You know, use that. That's really where you're going to find your best stuff, is finding an interesting plot point you liked from a movie or some other form of media, and then taking that and making it your own and sticking it in a game. It really, really does help a lot to have a real concrete image in your head first. Like I said, because that's how I do it. I really work backwards from there. And we'll talk in more detail about that and what that really means later. But like I said, working backwards like this, it's not going to give you a really complete plot from the get-go. So knowing that I was going to leave the plot open and kind of explore the plot as the game went along, so I didn't, limit my choices by playing the whole thing out right away, I needed to build the game as best I could without really doing much with the plot. So to do that, I really had to figure out first what type of game I was running. And I don't mean themes. Like I said, this game will have more of a cosmic horror bent to it eventually, but I wasn't talking about that, or a mystery game, or a political game, or high adventure, or anything like that. I was talking about structure. How is a game structured narratively? There's a lot of ways you can break down games, but I find two of the most popular ways to do it are either a sandbox game or a linear game. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. A sandbox game is a game where it really allows the players a great sense of freedom. They can set the speed, the tone, even the plot of the game to a large degree. And a lot of DMs will use this setting, or this structure really, because it allows them to kind of take a back seat, let the players drive the story, drive the plot, and allows the DMs to really focus in on the NPCs and the world setting itself. So a lot of times DMs will set up an initial encounter, repel a goblin attack, and then you realize the goblins came from this mountain, and they may have been funded by this lord who was doing something, and he has some, other people who are working behind him and other motivations. And the players go deal with problems as they arise and see if they're interconnected or not interconnected, and go from point A to point B and kind of what goes on in each place. So each place they go to is going to have a new plot point, it's going to have a new quest hook, it's going to have a new angle and spin on what's going on. So it really moves everything. A lot of times each of these plot points are going to be disconnected from each other and independent. It's not going to necessarily be this long, dynamic, intertwined plot with a sandbox. It's really go to point A, learn the issue, maybe go to a couple other locations to fix it, and that little area is now done, and there's other plot points you can go talk to or deal with, but they're not all necessarily connected to the one you just finished, right? So players really like that because it allows them to kind of move the plot where they want to go. If they don't really care about the plot right here, they can move on to a different one. If they see a plot point popping up, they don't like it, they can skip it. If they really like it, they can really dig deep into it and do that. It really allows them to determine where the plot is going, which is great for players. It really gives them a sense of ownership and a sense of control, which is great. Like I said, the DMs like it too because it allows them to let the players drive it. Really lets players who are motivated to do that do it as much as they want, really generate their own plot. They can see a small hook and then run at it, and the DM can just make it explode into a much larger issue and give them more and more and more, and allow the players to really, really have control over that. However, there are a few downsides to a sandbox game as well. If you don't have players who really want to go actively exploring and looking for plot, you can very quickly find players lost and directionless and kind of just wandering around, not really sure what they should be doing. You need players in a sandbox game to be really motivated to generate their own plot, to explore, to push issues, to investigate, and not really be shown where the plot is. So that's really a downside there. The other issue I've found with sandbox games that I've been in is, while they're fun, the plots can be very deep and interesting, they're not very dynamic. You're not going to have a plot that's very long-reaching with lots of twists and turns to it. A lot of times it's a lot of independent plots that may be loosely connected together. Now, I'm not saying that you can't have a really dynamic plot in a sandbox game. I'm really speaking in generalities. So, if you have been in a sandbox game that has had a really good, complex, dynamic plot, share in the comments, email me. I would love to hear about them. I'm really just speaking my own experience playing in sandbox games I've been in. They've been great, but the plots have been, like I said, more loosely connected. I have a friend of mine, Justin, who's a DM, who we're going to have on later episodes as well. We're going to kind of talk about different styles of DMing. He runs games like this, sandbox games, and I was actually in one of his games in college, which was fantastic, but it was very much based on the characters and their decisions, which was fun, but the plot itself was very light. The whole storyline was the party was in one city and was trying to travel to another city, and then what happened to them on the way, and the character growth and things that happened. But there wasn't any major storyline that was going on. It was a lot of interconnected, independent quests that we completed, and then we would grow and change, and that was really what the storyline was. And that was fun, but not all players are going to want that. If your players really want a very involved, dynamic plot line, they're probably going to want a linear campaign, which is really kind of more what I do. Now, a linear campaign is really pretty much the opposite of a sandbox game. The DM is really going to set the tone. The DM is really going to set the speed of the game and the plot of the game. So the players are usually given a task or a goal or a mystery to solve, and the players go at that. They can solve it or fix this goal in any way they want to, but they're set upon a certain goal by the DM, and then everything they do getting to that goal is up to them, but the DM kind of points them in a direction and then lets them go. So this is usually how you set the flow of the game. You have a plot point, they go to it, they fix it, there's consequences of that, it branches to a different section, they go to that section, etc., etc., etc. So the upsides to this is the DM tends to have a greater control over the game, so if there's any course corrections needed in the plot, you can easily do that. We're going to talk about that later. There are definitely some parts in this game here where there are definitely some course corrections needed for this here, because my players would certainly gonna go off in certain directions. And the real major point I want to get across here for linear games is you do not want to force your players down a certain road. You know, if you give them a goal, like for instance now Tiber needs to find the Chalice of Queen T'Choa, fantastic. He's obviously motivated to do that. He's going to try to do that. But I do not want to set a specific way he has to go about doing it. I'm going to give him options. I'm going to give him ways to do it. As long as he is doing that goal and heading towards that scenario, I don't really care how he gets there. If you set your players on a certain path that has to be achieved a certain way, they have to go to a certain town, then do the next thing, and then talk to this person, and then solve this, and each plot point is meticulously planned out, you can have a real danger of railroading your players, or forcing your players to take certain actions, and not give them the choice, or at least even the illusion of choice, that they can go wherever they want and do whatever they want, which is really the whole attraction of Dungeons & Dragons. And that's really the downside to linear campaigns. You can have a really dynamic plot because it gives the DM a bit more control over it. You can have really dynamic NPCs, really twists and turns, and some really great surprises in the plot. But you have to be careful not to railroad your players and force them down a certain path. So like I said, you know, I tend to prefer linear games, but most of the time, I think most DMs would have a combination of the two. No one is 100% linear, no one is 100% sandbox. There's going to be parts of the game where it's a little more open-ended. There's going to be parts of the game where it's much more straightforward in what the players are supposed to be doing. Now, we're going to have some articles listed down in the comments and detail sections of the show here about railroading, because it's a really big controversial topic amongst DMs. You know, I think railroading can kind of be overused as a general term. You know, I don't think railroading is really good, but there are times where I think your players really do need to be kicked in a certain direction, and that can go one or two ways. You know, you can really do it, and the players can respond to it and realize that, you know, my DM is just trying to get the plot moving, trying to get us all to have a good time, or you can do it in a way where the players really feel like you're forcing them to follow your plot. So it's a very fine line you have to walk. You know, like I said, my friend Justin, who I've talked about earlier, never does this, lets the plot go wherever he wants, which is good, but at times, there's one story that I unfortunately wasn't involved in, but the rest of the players that I met later were, where they were in one location where there was no real direction what they should be doing. So they were in this one location for out of game time, about 6 months, just kind of wandering around, because Justin wouldn't kick them into a certain direction. So they just aimlessly sat there for months and months and months, which they enjoyed, but at the same time, they'd wish maybe something had happened. They could have gone somewhere. So there are pros and cons to both. So when you're looking to set up your own game and your own structure, really read some of these articles I'm going to list here, really look into them, and decide what parts of it you like and parts of it you don't like, and then pick and choose as you go. So I knew Nate very well. Like Nate and I said last episode, we've been friends for a very long time, and I knew Nate would prefer a game that was a little more linear. You know, he really wants to have a certain direction to go. This is the plot. This is where we're going. This is the goals. So I decided I was going to give him a linear game. But I wanted to get it structured in a certain way that would really be exciting and great for Nate. So I thought about how I could really structure the game within the linear subset. And I decided what I was going to do is take my favorite game of the time, Mass Effect, and really take the Mass Effect structure and interpret it into the plot. Now, I'm not talking about taking the actual plot of Mass Effect, obviously, since it's not going to work really well if you're familiar with the game in a fantasy setting, since it's kind of a hard sci-fi game. But instead, what I was going to do is use the narrative structure the Mass Effect set out to kind of hide the tracks, so to speak, from Nate, so he didn't realize that he was being put on a path. So, really what I did is I borrowed the narrative structure. So, the beginning of Mass Effect starts out where the hero's on a mission. The mission goes badly, goes wrong in some way. He's introduced to the main villain. He sees something really bad has happened and he has to fix very quickly because it's a major, major problem for the rest of society or the world. So this unexpected thing kind of connects to a larger problem. The villain is then using the thing that he's found or stolen for a larger issue. So he's using it as a means to an end. The villain has a whole army or a large group of people working for him. The villain has a real powerful underling or underlings that has a tie to the party, or maybe a tie to the setting directly, and that kind of expands everything. The villain then attacks the base of power of the heroes, but is barely stopped. And in stopping the villain, the heroes realize that they've now stumbled upon something much, much larger, and that has been going on for a lot longer than they had anticipated. The problem they just stopped was just one symptom of a much bigger cause. Now, this is pretty standard when you break it down like this, but it really gives you a good idea of how to build an arc. In my games, I have an arc structure. So we have the beginning of an arc. There's a villain or a problem or a conflict that has to be resolved within that arc. So you have that, and by the end of the arc, that conflict is resolved. But in resolving that conflict, it then ties into the next arc. The consequences of stopping it or not stopping it, the choices you made, then bleed into the next arc, which is an independent conflict, but it's directly tied to what just happened. So this campaign here actually ended up being 5 arcs long. The first arc is just started now with Tiber. Then we have characters introduced later. We have my wife, Stacy, who plays a character who's introduced in the 3rd arc. So we're going to talk to her when she comes in. And then our friend Brett has a character introduced at the beginning of the 4th arc. So the first 2 arcs are going to just be Tiber, Nate playing him, and we're going to talk really more in depth with the other players in the show up and about the arc structure as well later when those become much more apparent, usually probably by the end of the 1st arc. Using the Mass Effect plotline as a template, doing a linear game, and using the tower as my inspiration to work backwards, I really started planning. So, obviously with the Mass Effect template, I needed a villain. I needed someone mysterious and menacing, compelling, someone that's going to really drive Nate to be interested in what's going on with him. So, I have a particular type of villain that I like. I think everyone has a villain that they like, this type of villain. My villains are often doing something for what they believe to be the right reasons, but aren't necessarily. They're not necessarily good, but they don't think what they're doing is necessarily evil. They're not sitting there twirling their mustache and laughing like, ah ha ha, I have the hero's girlfriend tied to the tracks just for the sake of killing her because it's funny. I like villains to be a little more nuanced. They have a specific goal. They agree with the conclusions of what that goal is going to really be when it's completed, but it's twisted and weird. But they're twisted and weird, a little crazy. So I don't always use this villain, this kind of conflicted but possibly honorable villain, but it's become a bit of a staple of mine. And my players claim it's my style of gaming to use this kind of villain, and I'm not going to disagree with them. Everyone's going to have a style. Your villains are definitely going to be a big part of that. So I began making the villain. I decided to make him an elf to kind of make him different from everyone else that Tiber's going to be meeting in the game, since he's in Amarant, which is pretty much all humans. So an elf would be nice because to be an outsider, someone that Tiber hasn't interacted with, someone the other NPCs probably haven't interacted with much, to really give him kind of an alien and other feel to kind of reinforce the whole villain aspect. So again, the villain needs to be doing something. The villain is usually, in any story, the person really moving the plot along. If there was no villain, the hero would just go about his day, eat his breakfast, do his job, and then go home. The villain is what shakes up the daily routine. He's the one that causes the momentum of everything going on, all the narration. So I needed to give him a goal for him to accomplish. And I really recommend when you make a villain for a beginning session like this, give him a goal that's attainable with a little bit of an extra bonus that he's trying to get across, and then just stop. Let him work towards that goal, let him try to succeed or fail, and don't worry about why he's doing it or really what the major implications of this are until later. I've said this before, you do not want to paint yourself into a corner. The more details you put down in paper before the game starts, the more issues you're going to have if the players try to move against that or do something totally outlandish, or if inspiration hits you and you go, oh, that would have been great to have, the villain actually be this person's son instead. That would have been great. But if you've already set up a lot of the plot and you've already made some, game decisions and plot decisions where that doesn't make any sense, that inspiration you get in your head, you can't use it because you've already made it invalid, unfortunately. So you want to only plan the plot that you really need in front of you, maybe a little bit ahead, so you can switch on the fly. A lot of times your players are going to come to you and they're going to make some crazy choices or assumptions based on your plot that you really like. Use their assumptions. They're going to come to you and they're going to say, oh, I think the villain is doing this, or wouldn't it be great if this sort of thing happened, or whatever. Just random casual conversation. If they come up with an idea that you really like, use it. Pretend it's yours. They'll really think it's fun because they think they've, cracked the code and made a prediction, but really, you're taking their ideas and using them as your own. I knew at this point the elf needed the Chalice of Queen T'Choa for something. I had an idea what he was using it for first, but I knew that was only a means to a larger goal, which I didn't have a great idea at this point what that real larger goal was. And I didn't really worry about it because I knew that this villain, as I made him, was much more of a schemer and a manipulator behind the scenes, and he wasn't going to be interacting with the party directly right away, which was great because it didn't force me to give up all of his goals and motivations right away. If he was going to be in the background, kind of a mysterious, shadowy figure, I didn't have to do much with him. Make him compelling, make him interesting, say very vague things about him or have him say vague things. Let the players kind of machinate over that, really just kind of brew on it and digest it, and then give me some opportunity and some time to really come up with my own ideas further down the road. So I put that all on that back burner, which was great. I mean, that's a really good rule, a good thing to do in the first session. Anyways, you don't want to get too involved in the plot. Because, again, you don't know where it's going to go. You don't know if your players are going to come, if they're going to go. You're going to have new players join like we did. Your player wants to leave, and then the whole plot changes if it's based on that specific player's character. You want to really be able to give yourself some flexibility. And the best way to do that, I know I've said it before, is don't plan more than you need. That is the major takeaway I can give you for this. The other thing I did is, knowing that I wanted to give a mission for Tiber based on this whole Mass Effect template I was using, I also wanted to take a page from Mass Effect's book, and instead of having Tiber wake up in the morning and go about his daily routine, and have his breakfast and talk to his family, or God forbid, the classic D&D trope of him sitting in a bar or something, and then comes someone running like, oh no, there's some huge problem, the adventurers, oh we need adventurers, which is the classic D&D, cliche, which I really try not to use because it's used all the time by everybody. Instead, I opted really for a good narrative tool called In Media Res, which is right in the middle of the plot. So I had Tiber right in the beginning of the mission. He was already on the ship. He was already on his way to do something. He got attacked right away by the Ichirokans, so it just threw him right into the thick of everything. Really got, I hope, and I think Nate really said this last week, was really exciting and really got everything going really, really fast, which was great. Introduced the first NPC, which I knew could help Tiber drive towards the plot by giving him some motivation to help this character who would be with him. So it'd be a nice constant push of the plot for him, which would be good. Or if he really goes off track or has some problems, I, as the DM, can kind of answer some questions and kind of help him out with that, instead of just kind of sitting there and shrugging because I had no character to speak as me if the player had any questions. And I put a nice, like I said, a nice short winnable fight in the beginning to give Tiber something to do, Nate to get confident in Tiber's abilities and really get an idea how to use them in combat. The other thing, too, is the villain did win the first fight against Tiber. Really showed the villain was very powerful, way more powerful than Tiber, way more powerful than people Tiber has met before. And that's good. You definitely want to have that because it really builds, some ominous and menace to the villain, which is great. But you have to be careful using that really sparingly. If you have the villain just win every fight that he's in against the players, they're going to get very frustrated. You need to have it impactful. The players lose a fight. You want players to lose occasionally, but it has to be very specific reasons. It has to be very logical to the players. We're going to talk about that more later. There's a really, really big plot point coming up in a few sessions where this sort of thing happens, this real loss happens, and I'll have Nate on. We'll talk about making your players lose and how that's good and bad and how to use that correctly. So we'll talk about that a bit too often. So like I said, this one really left Tiber with a good sense of direction. Who is this elf? I need to get back the Chalice of Queen T'Choa, who is Marangora, interested in Princess Kirik and her culture. Like I said at the end of episode 1, really gave him a good sense of where everything was going and gave me a lot to plan. So I sat down with Nate at the end of the first session and said, okay, what did you think? And he liked it. And I said, okay, where is Tiber going to go next? What does Tiber think about this or think about that? What really intrigued him about the mysteries that were laid out? And Nate kind of gave me his answers, which gives the DM a good idea of where to go. You always want to have a wrap-up with your players and ask them what they're thinking of doing next so you can plan well for it and give them a good sense of control of the direction of the plot, even in a linear game like this. So you really want to end with a cliffhanger, with mysteries, talk to your players, figure out where you're going to go, give them what they want, give them motivations and mysteries, and really give them interesting characters to interact with on the friendly side and on the villain side. Because like I said before, the villains are going to drive your storyline. So your villains have to be very compelling. Now this elf villain is going to obviously be back later. He's a recurring villain. He's in the first 3 arcs of the game. We're going to get much more in depth to him, much more in depth about building villains, how to make villains compelling for your characters, how to really have them really interact in really specific and personal ways with your players to really draw them in. This character here really spoke to Nate. We're going to be talking about that in much greater detail later. And a few of the other villains we meet later really speak very much to the other players, to Stace and Brett's characters, who we'll meet, like I said, in arcs 3 and 4. So I hope you liked listening to this episode. We're going to get into much more depth about building a campaign and running a campaign as opposed to just setting up the first session in later episodes when we're much more deep into this campaign. If you have any questions, any comments or suggestions for future shows or future topics, please email me at greenphoenixrpg@gmail.com. Take a look at our website, greenphoenixrpg.com. Like I said before, you can find the descriptions of Tiber and Princess Kirker up there, Albert Stillwater, the setting, Amarant, Cerulean, the Serpent's Green Islands, as well as a bio on me and Nate. Again, if you care about reading my bio or Nate's bio, they're both up there as well as links to our YouTube channel, our podcast, Facebook page, and Twitter page. And again, if you enjoyed this episode, you want us to keep coming and giving you really in-depth looks at how to run a campaign from both sides of the screen, from the DM and player's perspective, please support this podcast. We have a page up at patreon.com/greenphoenixrpg. If you guys can just spare $1, $5 a month, it could really help us keep this podcast coming to you week to week. And again, subscribe to this video or subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any episodes. And we're going to have episode 4 coming out next week, which is going to be a narrative recap of the second session. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you on the other side.